Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm a professor of computer science and cognitive science and web science at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. And a number of the themes that were coming up in the previous talk fit very nicely here because the theme that's going to run through this talk is, oh, I just realized I should start my timer, is terminology or vocabulary. And so I'm going to talk about some about changing perspectives in human health enabled by precision medicine, but in reality, enabled by semantics and ontologies. All right. Is it working? How about this? All right.
Just use the arrow keys and it should.
I think I got something
Confused.
Okay, great.
Left, right. Should do it.
And actually this, if you're following the news, pretty much healthcare is moving to having the person in the middle. Do you see my cursor? No, you don't see my cursor. The person in the middle. And actually, if you look at any of the trends, this is a web page from the National Cancer Institute, but precision medicine is really here today, and it's definitely coming tomorrow. So precision medicine is basically looking at details about you, often genetically oriented details about you, to try to do better care. And almost every article, actually, if you get any money from NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which most researchers in the United States, if you're doing any kind of research about health, today, at least as a computer scientist, and most people who are funded, can't survive without being fair. The FAIR guiding principles talk about having findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And this article on the left is all about, actually this was from a geoscience journal, but almost everybody that I'm aware of is looking at trying to bring data together and trying to look at larger data sets to hopefully have more statistically significant pools. And this article on the left says you want to have a flexible repository. In this case, they're calling for a database design, a controlled vocabulary with explicit definitions. So we heard from the previous speaker that we wanted clear vocabulary items, and then keeping track of where that data came from and how to preserve it. So my angle, I'm a card-carrying ontologist. So that means that I'm going to define terms in hopefully ways that computers can understand in unambiguous ways. And so this spectrum is a pretty heavily quoted spectrum that says some people, I included, will just say if you've got a set of terms, like a catalog, that can be viewed as one of the most simplistic views of an ontology. So just a set of terms, I'm only going to use the terms in this list. And then I might move further and further to the right on the spectrum, moving to the expressivity, increasing the expressivity. So I just have a set of terms, then I have a set of terms and their definitions, then I have what a thesaurus has, a narrower or broader. So we heard about the measure terms. When you move up to the general terms, a lot of things get grouped together. And then eventually you get into my world, the knowledge representation world, where we have very articulate descriptions of all the properties of some class, all the restrictions for the values. And we define the terminology, we define the relationships, and then we have computer understandable sentences distinguishing those terms. Oh, just for my edification, how many people had heard the term ontology before? Oh, cool, my people. So I'm going to give two examples. I'm going to give some examples from the Child Health Exposure Analysis Resource Project that I'm funded from the National Institute of Environmental Health Science, along with Mount Sinai. And I run the data science core of that program. So that means to this program that I'm coming up with computer understandable definitions, unambiguous definitions of terms that are needed by the data center. So this program is looking at child health, but in reality that could be all of human health, and exposure science, anything that you're exposed to. And so we start by looking at the terminology that CHEAR needs, but we are making it open source and we hope to get a lot of reusability out of it. And we're facilitating the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability of the data. And the ontology, where we're encoding the terms and their interrelationships, that's basically supporting the I and R and there, the interoperability and the reusability. And then the ontology-enabled infrastructure, so the things that let you find things and connect things together, that really supports the findability and the accessibility portions of FAIR. And so I've worked now in ontologies for 3+ decades, 3.5 decades, I guess. And in the old days, when I came up with these definitions of terms, often I didn't have very good starting points. Often I had to work with a domain expert to define the terms. Today, that's completely different. So the CHEAR ontology builds on stands on the shoulders of experts. We import, so basically we pull in these definitions from a lot of pretty heavily reused ontologies, and then we use this myriad, minimum information, to reference an external ontology term. So we pull in the terms that are needed. So like heavy, chemical entities or chemicals of biological interest. Actually, I think it's chemical entities of biological interest. Stato is a well-used statistics ontology, PubChem. A lot of these are NIH funded, and a lot of these have been funded for a decade or more. And so we're pulling in a lot of existing vocabularies that have been heavily vetted by a lot of domain experts, and then we're kind of gluing them together. And we only pull in the pieces that we need because some of these are actually quite big. And actually, as time goes on, we're pulling in more and more information. Like we just got a bunch of studies that look at all these cognitive measures, so we just pulled in COGAT. And so as we get more studies, we pull in more terminology. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to help the biostatisticians, and actually anybody who's trying to make sense of the data, put stuff together. So here's a simple example. One study has edu, age, gest, and BMI. Another study has V1, V2, V3. And then they have some descriptions when you're looking. And then they have some coding information. But I'm trying to actually be able to not only pull together the metadata about what the study contains, but actually the data itself, so that I can let the biostatisticians look at bigger pools of data that are intelligently, or maybe I shouldn't use the word intelligently, that are clear about what the terms mean to see whether they can put that data together or not. And so what I really have to do is I have to connect, this is my picture of a data dictionary, which is basically all my data comes in with some columns and some data filled in and hopefully some description. And then I've got to connect it into my backend. This is my picture of a tiny little ontology. Here I got some kids and some moms and some properties of mom, like education level, BMI, etc. And we do this through semantic data dictionaries. So basically, we connect the terms to terms in the ontology so that we can pull the data together and make sense of it. And then ultimately, we create interfaces like, this is a modified version of the CHEAR study, that I could do searches for studies that have particular properties, or I can look at the data itself. Here I've got, if you had really good vision, you would be able to see that I have 4 studies loaded. I have some lab data, I have some epidemiological data, and then I can see pie charts about how much data I've got in different of these categories. So I can look at the data level, like get me all of the studies that have cadmium exposure for both the child and the mother in the first trimester if it's the mother, or just get me studies that have over 50 kids and are in North America. So just looking at my time, okay. And so that's one place where I'm using ontologies to help get data mapped together so that I can do pooled data, so that I can do studies on larger sample sizes where I know how the connection was put together. In another project, this one, I'm trying to move from the genome level up to the population level. And I'm trying to do, this is the project called Health Empowerment by Analytics, Learning, and Semantics. I'm the semantic side of this, and I've got analysis and learning partners to try to bring together data to try to do more personalized health. And our Semantics-enabled framework has ontologies in the middle and this big knowledge graph in the middle, and keeping track of where we got all the data. So whether we got it from a recent study with a large sample size using methods that are reported in the literature as having being highly reliable, or whether I got it from gray literature and just some co-occurrence. And then I've got cognitive agents that make suggestions like you might have this disease, or maybe you should use this treatment plan. And then I'm using a bunch of reasoners that put information into my knowledge graph, keeping track of where all that information came from. And behind the scenes, I've got this probabilistic knowledge graph. This one I was just talking to someone in the back about. I've got diseases, drugs, and diseases, drugs, and proteins, and then I can query from any particular disease to a drug, or from any drug to a disease, or if I've got a mutation on a gene, something that goes through that gene, so I can see not just that something co-occurs, but how you got from one thing to another. So my knowledge graphs are behind the scenes. All the things are labeled with terms in the ontology that's very well defined. And so I can know how to make sense of that information. And so I'm going to try to leave some time for questions. Basically, my main message is that using semantics-enabled infrastructures and using ontologies with clear and unambiguous definitions of terms, I can enable personalized and population-level health. I can enable pooling of data so that I can do, so that your biostatisticians friends can do your analysis on larger sample sizes where we know that education level above high school really was above high school in all of the data that was put together there. And actually some of the things that you were getting questions about, you know, I would just add new greater specificity in the terminology, or some of the questions that you were saying of, you know, this is predictive for some disease, but maybe not for something else. I'm just going to make classes for that. And then we can do it with respect to those terms. So with that, I'll open the floor for questions. Thanks. You first.